Well, now we have reached an event that I have hinted at, pointed forward to a couple of times already. I hope I didn't hype it up too much. Crisis on Infinite Earths from DC Comics. This was a 12-part miniseries. It started in September 1985 on purpose because September 1985 was exactly 50 years since the publication of More Fun Comics, or, in other words, the 50th anniversary of DC Comics, which means it was also the 50th anniversary of comic books. It was written by Marv Wolfman with art by George Perez, and it was much more well done. It was much more well written than the Secret Wars from Marvel the previous year, which had been written by Jim Shooter. And the purpose of this miniseries was to essentially reboot or reset the DC universe and streamline things and try to clear up the confusion that had been going on for the previous 20 years, or more, actually longer than that, the confusion over all these parallel Earths in the DC universe, right? Remember all that Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, Earth Shazam, and so forth, which you've got all these different characters that DC owned. It's like every time they bought out a defunct company and took over their characters, then that's a separate little pocket universe that doesn't interact with the main one. And it was hard to keep straight for the fans. It was even hard to keep straight for the writers. So this miniseries, basically, just to boil it down, there's these individuals, these powerful aliens. That's what always happens, right? Powerful aliens that kind of watch over the universe. They monitor the universe. It's called the Monitor. And there's a bad guy alien called the Anti-Monitor, who's made out of antimatter, and he wants to absorb the multiverse to destroy everything. And so he's been going through all these parallel Earths, or parallel universes. It seems that Earth is a focal point in each of these universes, going through and destroying them. And that means that certain of the Earths, like Earth 3, which was that was the Earth where the Justice League was actually the crime syndicate, right? Ultraman instead of Superman, they were all bad guys. That whole universe gets destroyed by the Anti-Monitor, and the superheroes of Earth 1 and Earth 2 are warned by a character called Harbinger, that's kind of like the Herald or like the Silver Surfer to the Monitor's Galactus. Anyway, they're warned, and so they're trying to stop the bad guy. And over the course of this, a bunch of characters get killed off, including Supergirl in this iconic image, and the Flash, Barry Allen, the Silver Age Flash. Finally, toward the end, there are only 5 universes left. And as a means to both protect the universe and help to defeat the bad guy, it's a very complex story. Those 5 dimensions, those 5 alternate realities, all get merged together into one, which becomes like the new Earth Prime, which is basically Earth 1. So there is no more Earth 2 after the end of this event. There is no more Earth Shazam. Now everything is just one reality. And the way that is laid out, it's not that everything changes and all the characters are aware of it. When this happens, then everyone's memories are reset, and as far as they know, there's always only been one Earth and Captain Marvel / Shazam has always been on the same Earth as Superman. And there was no Golden Age Superman or Golden Age Batman or Wonder Woman. And now all those Golden Age characters like Green Lantern and the original Green Lantern and, say, Dr. Fate are actually just old people who were superheroes in the 1940s and are mentors to the new group that comes along. That is called a retcon. That eventually came to be called that. It wasn't called it at the time because no one had the word, because no one had ever really done this. Retcon, or retroactive continuity. So this means that as of September 1986, when this miniseries was over, everything is different. The past is different. So some fans liked the fact that things were streamlined and easier to follow. Some fans were upset because they liked the Earth 1 and Earth 2 idea. Some fans were upset. I was upset because that meant that continuity had changed. That meant that all of the stories that one had read about, the Justice League meeting the Justice Society, all that never happened. So it was hard to keep straight what actually had happened and what actually had not. But there was no denying, no matter how you felt about it, that it was very well done. It was very, very well written. And it sold a lot of copies. In fact, some of the issues of Crisis on Infinite Earths put DC up near the top for those months and sold 250,000 copies, which was nothing compared to what comics used to sell, but was up there with some of the top Marvel books for that time. So that was a big boost in the arm for DC. So they kept doing it, just like Marvel had started to do. Remember, I said that I talked about how these crossovers started in the X-Men books, other than, after Secret Wars. 1989 was this big Marvel-wide crossover. DC starts having a big one every year, too. You can see that they skipped 1990, but then they did two in 1991, and that just becomes standard for both Marvel and DC. Same idea. There will be a mini-series of 3 issues, sometimes up to 6 issues, which means 6 months long. And the bulk of the story, the meat of the story, will take place in that mini-series, but every single comic book put out by that company will tie into it somehow. So to get the whole story, you'd have to buy everything they made for that 6-month period. Then you get to take your breath, and another one would start. Marvel also had, there was one called Atlantis Attacks in the early 90s, but the big ones at Marvel, the big annual ones, were the Infinity series, 3 years in a row, written by Jim Starlin, with art by Ron Lim. This is what those recent Avengers movies were based on. Thanos trying to destroy the universe, basically. All the covers to the first series were done also by George Perez. All right, well, back at DC, everything is rebooted, so let's start over. Start over from scratch, basically. So you have Superman rebooted first, and John Byrne is brought over to do that. Remember, I told you that in '86, that's when he left Marvel and Fantastic Four, and this is what he left for, because he was just always wanted to work on Superman. In fact, when it looked like Marvel was trying to buy out DC, Byrne went ahead and did an entire comic book just as a sample to show Jim Shooter, to try to pitch for the idea of him to be the Superman guy. So that didn't happen, so he went over to DC. and became the Superman guy. This was a big event because Superman is their flagship character, and John Byrne was one of the most popular artists. In the early 80s, he was the most popular artist, but Frank Miller may have passed him up by this time. Anyway, what does it mean to reboot Superman? Well, the origin story is told all over from scratch, but it's a little bit different. The differences include the fact that in this new reality, Superman had never been Superboy. So, Earth 1 continuity, Clark Kent became a superhero when he was a teenager as Superboy. So that never happened. Another thing that happened is that all of a sudden his parents, his adopted parents who had passed away in Earth 1, never passed away. They're still there. Another difference is there weren't all these different kinds of kryptonite anymore. There was just kryptonite. I mean, there had been this thing that had grown over the years where green kryptonite kills Superman, red kryptonite takes away his powers, various other colors of kryptonite do different things. So all that's out the window. Also, Superman is no longer as all-powerful as he had eventually been portrayed to be on Earth 1. So that happened in 1986. This Time magazine cover is from 1988 for the 50th anniversary of the first appearance of Superman, but I included that here because it was John Byrne that Time magazine commissioned to do their cover, because at that time he had become the artist most closely associated with Superman. Well, this is the new reality, right? It's also coming at a time when the whole industry is making this massive shift toward all these crossovers, but also a shift in tone. A much darker tone is looming on the horizon. Actually, not looming, it's right there by 1986. And you could say that the Crisis on Infinite Earths and the way it ended was part of that, because there was a lot of tragedy, and there were some characters, like I said, who were killed, and others who were just wiped out of continuity as if they had never existed. Now, the reboot of Superman is a very optimistic, bright type of story, because that's what Superman, at essence, has always been. But that's kind of an outlier for this new reality. So, some people put the end of the Bronze Age, 1984, because of Secret Wars. Others, 1985, because of Crisis on Infinite Earths. I would go with 1985 for sure. Yes, Secret Wars led to massive changes in how things were done, but Crisis kind of reset the entire DC universe, plus launched a new mood. Which means that now we are in the year 1986 and the beginning of the Dark Age of comics. By the way, this is not a comic book from the Dark Age of comics. This is a comic book called The Dark Age, a post-apocalyptic thing that started in 2019. But, I had to find an image for this slide, and this is a good one. So let's look at some of the many things that happened in 1986 that signaled a shift, a tonal shift in comic books. In 1986, Art Spiegelman finished and released the first volume of Mouse. It's 2 volumes in all, and it was a few years after this, when the second volume was completed, that he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for the whole thing. So it's released as a book in book form, and immediately got a lot of critical attention. The second one, obviously, even more so, with winning the Pulitzer Prize. So, two things about this release at this time. Number one, it's one of the first really major works of sequential art or graphic novels to receive widespread critical attention and critical acclaim. I mean, there were write-ups about this in all the major newspapers. Number two, this story is a cartoon memoir that deals with Spiegelman's parents and their experience during the Holocaust in a concentration camp, and deals with survivor's guilt and suicide, and Spiegelman's own depression, and Spiegelman's lifelong efforts, mostly unsuccessful, to connect with his own father. So that's a very complex, mature storyline, and you have to admit, kind of dark. Also, in 1986, DC released a second 12-issue long miniseries like nothing that had ever been done before. Watchmen by Alan Moore and artist Dave Gibbon. Now, initially, this was supposed to be about the superheroes that DC had acquired from Charlton Comics. And if you're familiar with those superheroes, and then you're also familiar with the characters of Watchmen, you'll know that there's a lot of similarities. But ultimately, it was decided to make this something that was completely set apart from the DC universe. So when this came out, none of these characters were connected in any way with Superman or any of that stuff. They're in their own reality, which might sound odd because DC got rid of all that, right? But their reality isn't connected to anybody else's, at least at that point. So this graphic, well, it was a mini-series that was, when it was finished, collected into a single volume, therefore often referred to as a graphic novel. It is extraordinarily complex and deep, and on the surface, it's a thing about superheroes, but it is much, much more than that. It is the sort of thing that, well, with not only Moore's writing, but Gibbon's artwork, so many things, so many details are there just randomly and not randomly, but unnoticed on first perusal of so many panels that you can go back and reread this thing multiple times and notice new things about it. This was immediately heralded as something special. Now, the plot basically is that these superheroes, none of whom, well, only one of whom actually has superpowers, are kind of like the Justice Society / Justice League. There had been one generation of them in the 1940s, and now then there was a second generation, and superheroes have been forced to register with the government, and basically were essentially banned. And one of the former members of the team gets murdered, and a couple of the other members are trying to figure out who did it. And the more they dig, the deeper the hole is. And so this is kind of a way of looking at what it would be like if people, dressed up in these funny costumes and went around beating up on criminals in the real world. Although this particular version of Earth is one in which Richard Nixon stayed in office, not just for a second term, but they changed the law, and he just has remained. He's kind of like this dictator in charge of the United States, really. Anyhow, this was very well received. It's considered by many, probably would rank there close with Mouse as the most important and possibly the best example of comic book storytelling. And both of those were comic books, right? Because Mouse was serialized in Spiegelman's comic book, Raw. In 2005, Time magazine did an article. Now, Time magazine was founded in 1923, so they did this article in which their critics and writers compiled a list of what they considered to be the 100 greatest novels written in English since Time magazine started in 1923. So in an 82-year period. 100 greatest novels, not ranked in any particular order. It wasn't like starting at 100, counting down to number one. It was just 100 novels that they considered to be the best. And the Watchmen, there's no "the" in it, Watchmen was on there. And in fact, in a separate article, they highlighted 10 of those 100, and Watchmen was one of them. Not the greatest comic book stories, not even the greatest science fiction stories, the greatest novels. Well, if you haven't read it, I don't want to give too much more away other than what I've said, other than the fact this is a very, very dark story, disturbing in many ways. Also, 1986, Frank Miller and Klaus Janson, who had been his inker in his famous first Daredevil run, have come over to DC, and they do a Batman story. And again, this one is not set in regular DC continuity. This is a story that imagines what it would be like, say, 20 years in the future. So Batman is like in his late 50s, and he's been retired for a long time. And the same sort of thing that was going on at that very same time in the Watchmen. The government had passed this law saying superheroes had to be registered with the government. And Batman comes out of retirement to oppose this. And Superman is the one person that was allowed to stay a superhero, and is kind of like an agent of the U.S. government. And so he's given the assignment to stop this rebellion, basically, that Batman and Green Arrow becomes his junior partner in this, are fomenting. And there's a famous fight between Superman and Batman. And you might think, well, fight between Superman and Batman wouldn't last long. Except that, Batman's superpower is how smart he is, basically. So it's really powerful, kind of disturbing, and very, very dark. And like Watchmen, not only very dark, but not only tonally dark, but also very violent. Dark and gritty became the kind of the buzzword phrase at the time to describe these types of stories, which were critically well received and extremely, extremely popular. Also, in 1986, Frank Miller returns to Daredevil after being away from that title for a couple of years for this storyline, Born Again. Now, this was not a miniseries or a standalone graphic novel. It was a storyline over several issues of just a regular Daredevil comic. Miller was back as writer, but not as artist. The art was by David Mazzucchelli. This storyline received much critical acclaim, and I think stands the test of time pretty well. In it, the arch enemy of Daredevil, the Kingpin, finds out his secret identity and destroys his life. Basically, frames him for crimes, blows up his house, leaves him for dead. And that's all, in the beginning of the story. So this multi-part storyline is about Matt Murdock, alias Daredevil, in his efforts to kind of find himself again and to define himself again. And it is a spiritual journey as well as a physical and emotional one for the character and for the readers. But as you might expect with Frank Miller, it's even though it's a story of redemption, it is dark and gritty and very violent. Also in 1986, speaking of dark and gritty and very violent, The Punisher, who had been introduced a little over a decade before in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man as a villain initially. Kind of a sympathetic villain, but nonetheless someone that the good guys opposed, that gradually became more and more popular. And by the early 80s, his popularity had just like gone through the roof. He was showing up in everybody's comic book. And he had become an anti-hero. An anti-hero. And this is a limited series that was the first time the Punisher had a starring role in his own book, even though it's a limited series. Now, he did have a feature in Marvel, I think Marvel Preview back in the 70s, one of the black and white magazines. Right after this, because this was very, very popular, the Punisher got his own comic book title called The Punisher, and then immediately got a second one, Punisher War Journal. So the Punisher was everywhere in the 80s. I don't even need to tell you, if you're not even familiar with the character, you can tell by looking at him, he's kind of dark and gritty, right? We talked about him before when we were talking about the 70s. He was this guy, this career soldier whose family was killed by the mob, who then takes his military training and continues to be a soldier fighting against organized crime in a much more permanent and fatal fashion than your average superhero. By the way, this is something to think about. Anti-heroes were flourishing in the mid-1980s. I'm sure there have been scholarly articles written about it, but I find it interesting. If you stop and think about the fact that mid-1970s, the in thing in popular culture in general, from not just comic books but movies and TV shows and novels, was dystopian, post-apocalyptic, futuristic tales that were very dark. And then in the mid-80s, you've got, in the pages of comic books, you've got the Punisher and also Wolverine, who's become very popular, also dark and gritty and violent. And you've got, over at DC, they have a character called Lobo, no relation to the African-American cowboy from Dell. And in the movies, you've got Rambo, and you've got a huge spate of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Chuck Norris movies. So what is there about the zeitgeist of the mid-1980s, of the Reagan years, that made that so appealing? And it was also a feature of Watchmen. There was one of the characters, Rorschach, that very much was in the mold of the Punisher. Anyway, also in 1986, the Hulk goes gray again. Now remember, the first issue or two, he had been colored gray, and they changed that for technical reasons to green. But also in the first year or two of the Hulk's existence, he had not yet gelled into the Hulk that we all know and love, that basically is has the mentality of an elementary school child, right? Or preschool even. But in the first couple of years, the Hulk was pretty intelligent and also really, really mean. And Peter David, the writer, and Todd McFarlane, who was an artist that was starting to, around this time, gain a lot of popularity, he would be one of the next big stars, returned Bruce Banner to that version of the Hulk. So he literally got darker in skin tone. And he adopted another persona, Joe Fixit, that essentially was like a crime boss. So that's a lot darker than Hulk Smash. All right, well, all that was just 1986. 1987, Frank Miller does another Batman story, and his art partner from Daredevil Born Again provides the artwork on this one. You know, Dark Knight Returns, the previous year, Frank Miller had written and drawn. This one is called Year One, and it kind of like in the previous year, Superman was rebooted. This is a reboot of Batman, retelling, or in some ways telling for the first time, his origin story and his first year. It chronicles his first year as a superhero. Also, 1987, Green Arrow, not Green Lantern. Those guys it's all those green guys, right? Green Arrow gets another makeover. Primarily, the big difference is, well, there's some tweaks to his costume. It's all still green. But the big difference is he loses the Robin Hood cap and wears a hood instead. It starts with this mini-series by Mike Grell, written and drawn by Mike Grell of The Warlord, who was another one of these celebrity artists, kind of taking the character in a new direction with a new, much darker tone. And then after the miniseries, like with the Punisher, he got his own title, also by Mike Grell. There was a lot of buzz about Green Arrow, the Longbow Hunters, during the time it was coming out. Also, in 1987, even Spider-Man gets dark. Well, Spider-Man had also literally gotten dark, right? Because he's got this black costume, which, you know, due to the vicissitudes of comic book coloring, for decades, black was heavy shadows and blue highlights. Anyway, it's supposed to be black. There's this 6-part story that stretched over 2 months in Spider-Man's 3 titles he had at that time: Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, and Web of Spider-Man, in which he takes on his archenemy Kraven. But Kraven's methods are very different. The end result is very different. And at one point, Spider-Man gets buried alive. It is dark in tone. There's a lot of use of shadows and dark tones in this one, like literal dark tones, not just thematic tones. Well, it seems that every 10 or 15 years or so, Captain America, alias Steve Rogers, has a major crisis of faith and thinks about quitting. Remember, he had done that during the Watergate era in the mid-70s and became Nomad. Well, something kind of similar happens, but it doesn't play out quite the same. Essentially, in this storyline, which ran for 2 years in the monthly series, the regular Captain America series, written by Mark Gruenwald, Captain America is told by the U.S. government, after they had given him orders to do something and he thought that it was morally wrong, he is told that the U.S. government owns his shield and his costume and his identity, because it was all created by the U.S. government. Therefore, it's like their intellectual property. So therefore, he has to do as he is told. So he quits, hands in his shield, and stops wearing the costume and stops being Captain America. And the government finds somebody else that is more to their liking, a guy named John Walker, who is hyper patriotic. In fact, he had previously been a Captain America villain called Super Patriot. That was just, like way too patriotic, to the extent that he was very sort of jingoistic. He was very not nuanced at all. No shades of gray. Everything is good or bad. Practices usually poor judgment, has a quick temper, is extremely violent, can be very abusive. Not the best choice, which I think is the point, obviously, of the story, right? Captain America is not a costume. Captain America is Steve Rogers, and he is Captain America. His superpower is his goodness, essentially. So all this is going on, and Steve Rogers adopts a new identity. He just goes by the Captain, and he has this modified costume, and Iron Man, Tony Stark, even makes him a new shield that's all silver. And so this storyline goes on for a couple of years and finally culminates in the stunning conclusion in issue 350, when the original Captain America, Steve Rogers, squares off once and for all against the new hyper-patriotic, hyper-violent, dark and gritty John Walker. So in that cover there, on the cover of Captain America 350, Steve Rogers is the guy on the left, not the guy on the right. All right, well, while all of that was going on, over in the pages of Iron Man, Tony Stark has a crisis of conscience of sorts. Now, you could say that Iron Man was way ahead of the curve on dark and gritty, because even before Secret Wars, Tony Stark had spent a couple of years drunk and homeless, right? That's pretty dark and gritty. And now he's back on top of things, back in charge, got a new company, a new suit of armor. There for a while he went silver instead of gold. And there's this ongoing storyline in Iron Man called Armor Wars. It wasn't really a crossover, except there's, I think, one crossover with one issue of Captain America. But essentially, Tony Stark learns that his technology that powers his armor had been stolen years ago, and he didn't know it, and had been basically spread around, and various different super-powered people, mostly super villains, but also some superheroes, had been essentially violating his copyright with their suits of armor. And so he decides that he is going to nullify all those suits of armor out there, which is one thing when he's catching bad guys, like the Collector, he's that ugly guy on the right, or the Beetle in the upper left. But then it starts to become more problematic. It's problematic, really, to start with, but it becomes more problematic when he starts going after superheroes like Stingray, or the Guardsmen, which are these guys in green suits of armor that essentially work for the U.S. government. They're not superheroes. It's just sort of like military. And this leads him into conflict with Steve Rogers. As you can see right here, when Steve Rogers finds out what's going on, he goes to Tony Stark, who tells him, and by the way, notice that kind of mixture between a Jerry curl and a mullet that Tony Stark is rocking there. I can't explain, Steve, but I'm asking you as a friend not to stand in my way. And Steve Rogers says, I may no longer be Captain America, but I'm still an American. And the Guardsmen are necessary, right? The cover of this issue where this confrontation takes place says, Friends No More. So this is where, in the comics, the shift happened away from the bromance that typified the Bronze Age. This is where the wedge develops between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, which would be played on much more about 20 years later in an event called Civil War. So they square off and fight it out here. Meanwhile, with the retcon of the DC universe, all of a sudden Superman and Batman are relatively new at their jobs and have not been friends for years and years. And in this new DC universe, they don't like each other or trust each other at all. And that kind of becomes sort of the norm among these heroes that once upon a time had been portrayed as, the best of friends.